Thanks so much for the introduction. I hate hearing about the stuff I've done from other people because then I feel like the expectations get raised a little bit too high, and I got to live up to them, right? Because I don't remember doing some of that stuff or what it was like to be in the midst of trying to survive and be an academic early on. Let me thank Sean and Philip again, right, for bringing Red May back into an in-person gathering. I was here for the last Red May back in 2019 and really enjoyed it. I like the format. As I've been telling people, it's basically like an academic conference except fun, where you get to sort of roam around, have drinks with people, and enjoy yourself. And so I really, I'm glad to be back here again. I didn't particularly like the Zoom format. I think a lot of us have been zoomed out, facing some Zoom exhaustion. So I wanna use this chance, right, to be back in Seattle, have a chance to talk about this new book that's out, but I also want to talk beyond the book, right? I want to go into some other aspects that aren't fully covered, and maybe try to clarify a few things as well. I've been getting a whole host of reactions from people, longtime friends who are run the gamut as far as their place in the world, right? If people who've read the book who are abolitionists, people who've read the book who are Marxists of various stripes, people who are liberals, and so it's been interesting to hear the reactions from different folks, and it's been great so far. I'm going to speak about the book, the title of which is actually borrowed from an old article I wrote called "The American Left After Black Lives Matter," right? And for the purpose of a book title, I cut the first part of that off, but it still stands. And so, unlike some of the early reviewers, when it was at an academic press, the book is not saying that Black Lives Matter is over, right? It's not saying that Black Lives Matter doesn't matter as a phenomenon, but it's calling us to think about where are we in this particular moment? How has it changed the world that we live in? What have been some of the successes at this particular moment? And what should we be thinking about going forward, right? So what I want us to do over the next 40 minutes, 45 minutes, depending on how long I go, I want us to remind ourselves of our lives as citizens, right? As I'm talking about these different aspects of Black Lives Matter, I want us to remind ourselves of who we're actually connected to in real life, in our jobs, in our neighborhoods, in our communities that we're a part of, and not just the people who we engage on social media. I want us to think about the real power that we wield in a place like Seattle, this grounded context of Seattle, or where I'm living this year in Los Angeles. What are the real political fights like? And I want us to keep that in mind versus the debates that go on online, which I get tempted to engage in sometimes as well. So I'm going to say a bunch of different things here. I don't expect everybody to agree with them, but I want to put some arguments out there so that we can have a good conversation, right? So George Floyd 3 years later, right? I'm not one of these people who's going to jump out and say that nothing has changed, right? I was on a podcast earlier this week, and that was one of the things that they were trying to get me to say in a way. It's like nothing's happened. We're right back where we were before. And a lot has changed, right? There's been so many different pieces of legislation introduced in many different states, 140 different pieces of legislation just in the first year after the George Floyd protests. And a lot of this has been, I think, long overdue, right? So some jurisdictions, now earmarking money to purchase body cams, others revising use of force policy. Still other jurisdictions, locales, states, deciding that they're going to use better screening and training for officers. Others are engaging in trying to come up with nonviolent approaches to dealing with mental health crisis, right? And still others are doing the things that reformers have been calling for years, right? Like decriminalizing the desperately poor, doing away with money bail, reducing the level of fines and fees that oftentimes, compound for people who don't have a lot of income and ends up in jail time and potentially prison time, depending on their situation. Providing more adequate funding for public defenders' offices, using drug courts instead of incarcerating people who may have substance problems, legalization of cannabis in a lot of different states, even though not all states are doing that in a progressive way. Some are legalizing and also exonerating or expunging the records of people who've been convicted of cannabis in previous years, and others are still other places still treat this a as a crime, right? In my home state of Louisiana, which I'm going to talk about a little bit in a second, people are still going to jail and to prison for possession and with intent to distribute cannabis. Other folks are pushing for legalization of sex work, right, and decriminalization of certain kinds of work, which lead to unnecessary jail time and prison time. And then, of course, there's immigration reform that folks are demanding paths towards normalization and citizenship across the country. One of the things that I criticized back in 2020 was the overly symbolic aspects of it and the ways in which corporations swoop down to take advantage of the moment, right? A lot of the corporations that were in trouble during the shelter in place, those that were being criticized for their treatment of essential workers, right? They used the moment of Black Lives Matter's, rebirth as a way to do some damage control and, rehabilitation of their images, right? We saw some of that. Companies like Amazon and Grubhub, DoorDash, all of those things that we were depending on in the midst of the shelter in place, found a way to use the pandemic to their, the rebellion to their advantage. And you also saw like a lot of professional sports teams, other corporations, offer symbolic acts of solidarity. I was pretty hard on that at the time. I'm still critical of it, right? I do think that sometimes this is like not necessarily helpful, but it does represent in certain moments a shift in the culture. I'd rather see that than a complete neglect of it that we saw back when the lone wolf, Colin Kaepernick was taking a stand and nobody sort of rallied behind, nobody in professional sports necessarily, very few people rallied to his side. So I think it is somewhat of an improvement. I've also said this, and I'm going to disclose a little bit about myself in this talk. I have 3 adult children, all of them Black. They've had their own run-ins with cops, over the years that we've talked about. They've been engaged in, some of this activism even before George Floyd. And I wonder what this means for them on some level. Like, what will it mean for them and for kids who are even younger than them, and that this is the moment that they came into political life, right? So we can't necessarily measure that or think critically about it just yet. So there's those aspects. There's a story I tell sometimes about, walking around my neighborhood during the George Floyd rebellion, and there's all sorts of things happening, right? There's people who are killed not far from where I live, in Chicagoland. And then at the same time, simple things like watching little girls on the sidewalk with chalk marking out Black Lives Matter and scrawling out this stuff like little kids, like 5 and 6-year-olds, and thinking about what that means, like going forward. I think it's something that I'm not completely settled on as far as where it might be heading. Now, there's limitations though, right? And there's things that I talk about in the book that I think we have to go a bit further in terms of thinking about the possibilities. I want to take us back for a second to the 1980s, right, into my own making as a intellectual. And I want to use it as a way of discussing both the origins of Black Lives Matter and the patent limitations of it as a notion, right? On some level, the Black Lives Matter as a phenomenon, as I say in the book, is an outgrowth of the limitations. It's a response to the limitations of the Second Reconstruction, right? And the Second Reconstruction being a period of major progress within the United States initiated out of the civil rights reforms of the 1960s. That is a period of progress, right? The country changes dramatically. I grew up in the Deep South. I grew up in a part of Louisiana that still is one of the poorest jurisdictions of its kind in the country. And if you talk to people there, they can talk about what it was like when they couldn't shop at department stores. They can talk about not being able to vote. They can talk about being intimidated by, by vigilante groups. And my hometown, I should add, was actually the site of the largest voting rights massacre during the Reconstruction period, back after the Civil War, right? So it's that kind of place. So when you talk to people like that, they'll acknowledge that there's been dramatic change that's happened in the country since they were, younger people. But I want to discuss that moment, right? The 1980s and early 90s, right? I left Louisiana in 1993. And so this year actually marks 30 years since I entered grad school. I'll talk about why that's relevant in a second, right? So the second Reconstruction and the carceral expansion, right? That's what I was living through without knowing it, without being able to call it mass incarceration during the 1980s. That's what we were living through. And part of what happens here, right? And I've said this before, I'll say it again. It's not particularly helpful to talk about slavery as a place where mass incarceration begins. It's not even helpful to talk about the Reconstruction period as the moment, even though there's convict leasing, there's other forms of punishment that are being enacted. By and large, right, the carceral system that we have, and many people have written about this, doesn't really take shape in the ways that are familiar to us until much later. It's not during the antebellum period. It's not during Reconstruction. And it's not even during the Jim Crow period. But it's really much later, right? If you look at the 1960s as one moment, where we begin to see some of the massive changes. In the middle of the 20th century, and folks in this room can recall this, in the middle of the 20th century, at the end of World War II, we can use that as a marker, whites still constitute the majority of people in American jails and prisons. Even when Reagan is being sworn in as president, whites still constitute a slim majority in American jails and prisons. But it's during the 1980s and early 90s that those numbers change dramatically. And so I think we need to focus on that, right? Instead of the 13th Amendment, instead of slave patrols and all the rest, those are certainly part of the country's carceral history. But this system we're facing right now really takes shape much later. And like I said, as a kid in Louisiana, I was a teenager in the 1980s, it was palpable, right? We knew it, you could feel it. But we didn't have the language, right? We weren't talking about mass incarceration. We talked about it primarily as an extension of Jim Crow, right? That was the way we understood it. This was racism. Because of what we experienced, we were seeing people who looked like us who were being arrested and who were being brought to jail. So that's where it begins, from a position of advocacy, not necessarily a full-on analysis for us in Louisiana, which became the capital of mass incarceration, right, for some time. Now, a couple of problems about this, right? So on one level, it's politicizing for me as a kid. 17-year-old. I'm already against the death penalty. Already involved in a national coalition to abolish the death penalty, right? Already attending meetings with Sister Helen Prejean and other activists in Louisiana. As a freshman in college at Southern University. At 19-year-old, I'm already taking kids to go and visit the prison, to meet with the warden, to talk to inmates, talk to people who are former gang members. Now, the issue with this, right, again, we understood it mostly as a function of racism, and we also tended to think of it, in the people in my world, we tended to think of this as a problem that needed to be rectified, not through legislation, but through behavioral change, right? Coming out of more of a black nationalist framework, our understanding was that we needed to push people onto a different path. And so you should say no to drugs, right? That was part of the rhetoric, the milieu at that time. You should, not be involved in violence. You should settle conflicts through nonviolent means. And so there's a whole host of things that we're arguing in the 80s and early 90s that are fairly conservative, right? I mean, they really, the star of the show in the 80s, of course, is underclass discourse, right? This idea that if people are poor, if people are unemployed, if somebody ends up in prison, it's their fault, right? That starts out as a liberal democratic thing, in the 1960s, but ultimately it becomes, taken up more effectively and forcefully by Republicans, right? And it's something that us, even as African Americans, and I grew up in a completely black world pretty much until I was in grad school, we embraced that. That was the way we thought about it, right? If you end up in prison, it's because you just made bad decisions. Yeah, white people are going to be racist, but you can't control that. What you can control is your own behavior. So there's a type of conservative analysis that dominates black politics, even during the 1980s and early 90s, that really prevents us from seeing the full scale of what's happening in terms of the carceral expansion. Now, of course, there's some activists who can see it, right? The people coming out of the 60s who already had a good analysis, people who were like Panther veterans who had a good analysis. But by and large, right, the dominant ideology in a lot of activist circles, certainly on black colleges and other places, was that black nationalist perspective, right? That's why Louis Farrakhan can get, a million people out onto the National Mall. And what was the analysis? Black men need to atone for their transgressions, right? 1995. That is an extension of the kinds of analyses that I grew up with. So in a way, it's interesting. There's this groundswell, a grassroots justification for some of the neoliberal reversal that's taking place. Even though people are coming from a place of benevolence, right? They care about folks in their community, want to steer them away from prison time or other kinds of problems, that it is a rhetoric which works well within the context of both Reaganism and then ultimately new democratic politics of Bill Clinton, who claims victory when he dismantles the welfare state, moves us towards workfare, and when he's able to earmark money to demolish public housing across the country, right, which would have devastating effects for communities, for cities, up until into this century. Now, what was working there, and I think this is where the book, I try to take in a slightly different direction. What we did have right in the 1980s and 90s was a sense of who were the persons most likely to be pulled into the vortex of carceral power. And it's not all blacks, right? And this is what the problem I have, even with the Black Lives Matter slogan, right? I mean, of course, Black Lives Matter, right? And there's still plenty of racism in the country that we should be fighting against. But in terms of thinking about police killings, in terms of thinking about those persons who are routinely surveilled by police, harassed, stopped, arrested, prosecuted, convicted, and sent to prison, and then regulated and surveilled even afterwards, right, after they've served their time, we're not talking about all black people, right? So the question we need to ask ourselves is, which black people are we talking about? When we think back to all of the major high-profile cases of Black Lives Matter, mobilization, right? These cases of police violence against black civilians. When we see those videos, right, we're all sort of struck by, the gruesome nature of some of these and unjust nature of some of these killings. What we're not always paying attention to, and maybe what is also pushed away from this analysis, is, who these people are. Right? Who are they in the world? What sort of position do they have in this economy that we live in? And I think, what happens is usually two things that happen. When somebody's killed by police, the fraternal order or whatever Blue Lives Matter forces exist in a particular location seize upon the victim and try to demonize that person, right? Pull out their background, talk about who they were, what their rap sheet was like, how many times they've been convicted, how many warrants were out for them. They try to smear the person so that it, ultimately can justify whatever happened. And then on the flip side, many activists want to stop that conversation, right? We don't want to have, we don't want to focus on negative aspects of a person's life. We want to celebrate the fact that they were hardworking, that they were a parent to multiple kids, that they were loving, family member, community member. And the question I think we should be able to ask, I think we can hold both ideas in our heads at the same time, and we can take a genuinely left perspective on this, it's quite possible for somebody to have multiple convictions and still be a loving father, still be a great person. It's quite possible for somebody to have had a raw deal in life and not deserve to be killed by a police officer, right? What's hidden in some of this conversation and the way in which it's typically framed in popular discussions is the actual position of most of the victims, not all, among relative surplus population, right? People who are unemployed, people who've been made obsolete by capital intensification in various sectors of this economy at this point. And so if we look specifically at some of these victims, again, people like George Floyd, right? What was he doing? Allegedly, he passed the $20 bill to try to buy some cigarettes in a convenience store. He also arrived in the Twin Cities as part of a program, a Christian ministry for people who had been struggling with addiction, right? So he was there to try to find gainful employment, get his life back together. If we think about Walter Scott, who was shot in his back in North Charleston, South Carolina, Walter Scott was fleeing. He had an unpaid warrant, or had a warrant for unpaid child support, right? Which is usually a marker of economic hardship. Freddie Gray and many other victims had previous, contact with police over petty drug dealing. Alton Sterling, who was killed in Baton Rouge, not far from where I used to live when I was living in Baton Rouge as a student, was selling used CDs, or pirated CDs, in front of a gas station. In a similar manner, Eric Garner in Staten Island was selling loosies. You buy a box of cigarettes, a carton of cigarettes, you sell them individually to make income. Rayshard Brooks, who was killed in Atlanta at the height of George Floyd protests. Remember this episode? He was like in a Wendy's drive-thru. He had fallen asleep after being out, partying one night. Somebody calls the cops. He sort of negotiates with them, talks calmly for a long time, but ultimately, he gets into a scuffle with these cops. He takes a taser. As he's running away, he looks over his shoulder and they shoot him, right? They shoot him down and kill him. Rayshard Brooks did a video which was released a few months before he was killed, where he talked about the difficulty of being a formerly incarcerated person and how tough it was for him to find employment, and how he wished that people would actually treat him treat him as a human being. They would see him and not the crime that he was involved in, right? So when we look carefully at this situation, Black Lives Matter as a slogan, it works in some places, right? It works in a place like Chicago, where like 70% of people who are killed by police are African Americans. But when you leave places like Chicago and go to other jurisdictions, other states, the demography changes. And the question we should ask ourselves is, what do these people have in common? Right? What do they have in common? And of course, every incident of police violence is different, right? And in some cases, even though this is tough for us to acknowledge, some cases they are justified. People are armed. But in many of the cases where it's clear that there's some injustice, we need to talk about who these people are. Where do they come from? What place do they occupy in our economy? And I don't think a focus on racism is enough. It doesn't help us. It actually divides the way that we think about these different victims, both victims of direct police violence, but also people who are caught up in the carceral dragnet. So one question I want to throw out to people, and I got my own answer, and we can talk about it in the Q&A. But I don't think structural racism is particularly helpful, right, as a way of explaining this particular set of problems. And I'm asking you all, what does it mean to even be anti-racist today? Keep that question in mind. We'll come back to it a little bit later. What does that even mean? Because at some point, at least during the Jim Crow period, to be anti-racist meant to reject the very idea of race, right? That we actually do have distinct biologically defined races of people. And also to reject the idea that racism should justify a person's station in life. And it should justify the kind of segregation that existed during the Jim Crow period. I don't think that's the way a lot of people talk about race now, right? There's a way in which race and racism, we all want to condemn racism, but there's a way that race tends to be valorized, particularly within academic conversations. And it makes it difficult to talk about some of those nuances that I just mentioned, right? It makes it difficult to see the complexities of black life. And so, like I said, it's been 30 years since I started grad school. Even before that, having grown up in an activist black church, I spent a lot of time reading books, even as a teenager, stuff like Carter G. Woodson, Miseducation of the Negro. They made us read that stuff as a kid, right? Thinking about these issues for a long time. It's frustrating at this point, at this stage, to see the kinds of generalization. And I actually think that Black Lives Matter as a phenomenon, one downside, it's actually made it much more difficult to talk about the black population in any meaningful way, right? And to talk about real differences that divide the population. And a lot of it is not necessarily from black people always. Sometimes it's whites who are stepping in trying to offer an analysis. So liberal anti-racism is not enough. Blacks are twice as likely to be killed by police than are whites. But white victims typically make up a plurality of those who are killed by police. I've said this before. A bigger issue here, though, and this is another one I want you all to think about. We got to make take some time to discern, right? Not to separate out and say, oh, these people are different. These people are not like the rest of us. I'm not engaging in underclass moralizing, but I think we need to talk about the desperately poor, talk about people who are unhoused, talk about folks who are unemployed and underemployed, because they represent an important part of the society as it exists right now. And we can't really get there if we use these generalizations that we've become so accustomed to, in this mode of sloganeering either Black Lives Matter or New Jim Crow. So where does this system come from? Like, where does this particular mode of policing, when does it really come into being? How does it take shape? What I do in the book is I talk about the post-war urban transformation as an important moment. And people who are old enough can recall this, right? That American cities look very different in the 1920s and 30s. But after World War II, we embarked on a massive set of changes supported at the federal level and implemented throughout every state in the Union, where we engaged in suburban expansion, right? We began to build single-family housing outside of cities. We began to move some industrial production outside of cities, various other commercial activity outside of cities. And we even come up with this, what's now familiar, right? This landscape in our minds, this mental geography of the inner city, right? The ghetto, the suburbs, all of these things have certain they're loaded with power for a lot of us, right? We know what they mean, even though a lot of that's changed, right? But I think that's the signal and most important moment in terms of the beginning of the kind of policing that we become accustomed to now. For black people who are living in many parts of the country during Jim Crow, their problem wasn't necessarily over-policing, right? In many jurisdictions, many cities, it was under-policing, not having the support that they needed. And I mean, people told those stories. I've had a friend who was telling me this recently about Oakland and Richmond, California, how, somebody could be killed in a bar fight. Cops don't even show up, right? They show up maybe the next day to claim the body and interview a couple of people. So a big problem for a lot of black neighborhoods during the Jim Crow period wasn't over-policing, it was something very different. That does begin to change, however, during that post-war period and with the expansion of the middle class, mostly white middle class, right? One term that we get out of that period is the thin blue line, right? That phrase is coined by William H. Parker, who served as the top cop in Los Angeles from 1950 to 1966. He was a World War II veteran. And he brought some of those ideas back with him to Los Angeles. He helped to pioneered the use of cars, automobiles, police cruisers to manage vast urban space. And he had a very clear sense of who police should be, right? He actually thought police should be role models. They should emulate, they should provide the American public, and in particular the middle class, with a sense of what it meant to be a good citizen, upstanding citizen. He also thought that, they constituted this thin blue line separating middle class virtue and American, bourgeois civilization and various threats to it. In his mind, those threats during the post-war years were, godless communism, his words, not mine. Organized crime, which a lot of folks were concerned about, during that same period. And black people who, working class black people who were coming from Louisiana and Texas and Mississippi and filling up the Watts section of Los Angeles, right? And so, somebody like William H. Parker, right? He's really kind of a godfather of sorts, right? He sets the stage for so much policing that would come later, right? His style. If you're really interested in this stuff and you visit Los Angeles, there's a place, the Los Angeles Police Museum, which is in Highland Park. It's the police precinct where the Hillside Strangler investigation was conducted. It's also a precinct that the Symbionese Liberation Army tried to blow up, but their bomb failed, right? So some of their pipe bombs and other things are in the museum, and the original jail cells. There's also, other just memorabilia from that period you can look at. It's interesting, right? There's also some of the cars from the North Hollywood bank robbery that was shot up in the 90s. Became a justification for more militarization of policing, right? They said the police were outnumbered and outgunned by these bank robbers. So it's an interesting, space to look at. If you can get in, you gotta. You can't just walk in there. You gotta make an appointment to be able to visit. So something to keep in mind if you come to LA. One thing we should think about, though, right? So he's concerned about working class black people. There are people who are criticizing him within the force at that time, right? People like Tom Bradley, who was a beat cop, right? Tom Bradley was a black beat cop. He was also a really great athlete when he was in college at UCLA, and he ultimately became the longest serving mayor of Los Angeles and the first black mayor. But Bradley was outspoken. He criticized the treatment of black civilians by the LAPD as he was a beat cop, and ended up leaving to go to law school, and eventually, decided to run for mayor himself. So there's those sorts of voices that we need to return to and think about as we, recall this period. Now, another thing that I discuss in the book, and I'll try to wrap it up pretty soon. Another thing that I discuss in the book is the what that black population was like in a place like Los Angeles or Detroit or Chicago or any other city in the 1960s, and how there were important changes that are taking place even within black life that get lost if we take this kind of broad sense of, well, it's all white supremacy, it's all racism, there's not a whole lot of difference in terms of how black people are experiencing the country, right? One of the people I turn to is James Boggs, in a book that he wrote. I think it was first published in serialized form in Monthly Review, and then eventually as a full manuscript titled The American Revolution in 1963. Boggs is talking about two revolutions in that book. He's talking on the one hand about the revolution in production, right, the use of automation and cybernetics increasingly, and he's also talking about the potential for a revolution, right, in the country, how that can happen, like a left revolution, what it could look like. And Boggs, of course, for people who may be less familiar, was somebody who was originally from Alabama. He basically hoboed his way around the country. He came to Seattle first, I think, and then ultimately went back to Chicago and then to Detroit. And he found a job working for Chrysler as an auto worker. And in this book, Boggs talks about the impact that capital intensification is having, the use of new technology is having on the shop floor at Chrysler in a really intimate way, right? And he says that it actually is doing away with some of the old rivalries. Like the old rivalry in the shop for him was the ethnic rivalry, right? The newcomers, different immigrant groups, black migrants. He basically argued that that was beginning to dissipate. And now there was a new conflict between people who had seniority in the plant and who had won some gains through earlier union contracts, and those newcomers who were trying to gain a foothold within the context of a rapidly changing shop. One of the things that he says also is that not only is it altering the kinds of solidarity that might be possible on the shop floor, but it's changing the lives of people beyond the factory gates. And he laments about seeing more and more young black men on street corners, in pool halls, different parts of Detroit. And he fears that unlike himself, who was able to make his way to the industrial heartland, find gainful employment, purchase a house, and live a fairly decent life, he really felt that these people were not, right? They would never be able to be absorbed into the economy in the same ways. And he calls them, untouchables. He refers to them as outsiders. He refers to them in certain moments as disposable people. On some level, black people were, in the 1960s, right? They're canaries in a post-industrial coal mine. I'm using post-industrial in quotes, right? I know that term is fraught. But they are people who are some of the first to feel the jolts of capital intensification, right? And, you can go back and read Braverman. We can go back and read a whole host of folks during that period who are saying, this is not going to stop with heavy industry, right? But it's going to move into white-collar employment. And now we're living through a period where we see it threatening pretty much everything, right? Even the intellectual work that we do, right, is now up for grabs, right? So I think Boggs was onto something. Braverman, there's a way that we need to recover this critical view of technology for sure. But black people are the first to feel those jolts in cities, and they're concentrated, so they're more visible in some ways. But now we know all sorts of, various parts of the country we can go to are bombed out and busted, abandoned. I was just reading an article recently where it said you can purchase ghost towns in this country now for fairly decent money, like the cost of a house, basically. Like houses in some markets, right? But you can go into, old mining towns, Utah and other places. You can buy these towns, right? And have like your wedding or whatever you want to do. I don't know. Turn it into something else. This is where we are, right? So we've witnessed a period where, at first it was, the most desperately poor and segregated in central cities. But now these dynamics have fanned out across the country. One other quick example, my oldest kid ran track and field for Illinois State. And so I used to drive all around Iowa, Indiana, Wisconsin, Illinois to see his meets. And some of those places, they are done, right? Places that had like maybe one good industry, like John Deere or Caterpillar or some other. Once that's been changed, and some of those still exist, but they don't rely on as much labor anymore, right? And that's the case, and that's something that we got to think seriously about, right? There's a way that the term post-industrial, it's distracting. We're still an industrial country. We still produce a lot of things. We just don't rely on the same quantities of living labor to do that. A good case in point would be like Gary, Indiana, which is a pretty decimated place. But Gary Works still produces a ton of steel, right? They still produce high levels. That's a place where both Joe Jackson, the patriarch of the Jackson Five, Noel Ignatieff, the Marxist, and one of the people who gave us the notion of white skin privilege, also worked there for a time. But it's still humming as a place, right? It's still producing. If you go through it, the way I've seen it, sort of incidentally, I used to take the Lakeshore Limited from Rochester, New York to Chicago, and that line goes straight through the plant, right? So you see the steel mill up close, and it's a ghost town, but it's still going, right? It's still things are still happening there. So one of the questions that Boggs raises, and it's one that I want to leave you all with as I try to wind down. Job training is not the answer. This is Boggs in the 1960s, right? Job training is not the answer. He's like, we can train people for jobs, but as soon as you train them, those same jobs will probably disappear at some point. And he begins to make the case that, we have to think about not just ways to adhere to the dogma of work, but we've reached a point where we don't necessarily have to work in the same ways anymore. And a new set of questions are presented to us about reorganizing the society. Now, some of Boggs's premonitions and arguments, I would argue, are not so helpful, because he didn't anticipate like the ways that the service economy, gig economy would kind of rush in to fill the gap and allow people to stagger along, credit, all these other things that would allow the society to hobble along despite these changes. But we're still feeling it, right? We're still feeling it right now in terms of, vast reductions in the need of living labor in different places. And so what I'm trying to do in this book is to connect the problems of policing, the carceral expansion, back to these issues of relative surplus population. I don't claim to be the first person that made that argument. We can go back to like the late 1960s. George Jackson says as much, in one of his statements. He says everybody he's met in the California prison system is a part of what he calls the lumpen proletariat, right? So there's ways that I think we need to revive those arguments and think about not necessarily abolishing police, and I can make an argument for why I think that's not necessarily helpful, but we should think about abolishing the conditions that policing has come to manage in a period of post-welfare state capitalism. So a couple issues, and I know I've had discussions with a lot of my friends who are abolitionists about this. I'm interested to hear your perspectives on it. Can we name some countries, socialist countries, that didn't have police departments or military? That's one question for you all to consider and bring back to me. And can we necessarily have a society that separates force from political life and force from statecraft? This is an issue and one that I want us to consider. Can we also have social justice without courts, without public policy, without ways that we execute the laws? So the two major epochs that I've talked about, right? Reconstruction after the Civil War, and then again, the second Reconstruction coming out of the 1950s. Both of those entailed at some point the use of force. Old Confederates old plantation owners did not want to concede, even after they were defeated in the Civil War. They didn't want to concede that blacks should be property owners, should be able to run for office, should be able to live the lives that they couldn't have under slavery. And so the South had to be occupied by force, right? It's federal occupation. And the moment that that's lifted, right, the tables turn for black freed persons. Something of a similar shape and type happens during the second Reconstruction, right? It's not like, white Southerners saw the decision from the Supreme Court in 1954 and said, oh, of course, right? Separate but equal is unconstitutional. Let's let blacks attend schools with our kids. They didn't do that, right? They actually fought tooth and nail. They became even more repressive in the face of the changes that were being encouraged by the Supreme Court, but then eventually legislated by Congress. So they had to be forced, right, through military intervention, the 82nd Airborne in one case, the use of federal marshals, mobilization of the National Guard. I'm not saying that was a favorable, preferable set of circumstances, but it was necessary in order to move the country in a different direction. And so I wonder, how helpful is this argument about abolishing police in a context where, police are contradictory, right? And I try to capture those contradictions in the book, right? They're on the one hand, their historical role is to protect private property and to reproduce the current order. That's what they do. They also manage surplus population. They regulate the desperately poor in a context where we no longer are benevolent as a society. But they're also, they're also people who are living and working, and the institutions are contradictory and tragic and need to be discussed in detail and with some sense of nuance. So I actually think that one of the things that Black Lives Matter has done is it's pushed a redistributive conversation, focusing on police budgets, and decided that we should take police budgets and reroute those funds towards more benevolent purposes. But I think that doesn't really go far enough, right? It's not just police budgets and policing itself that's necessary for the kind of capital accumulation regimes that exist in cities. There's a whole host of other public giveaways that are happening in cities that we should also target, right? So if you think about, stadium construction and these things we'll be talking about tomorrow night, or just the, all manner of tax breaks, land grants, infrastructure improvements on the public's dime that benefit corporations, right? We should also target those things. And I think we should be engaged in a sort of multi-pronged set of approaches to decommodify basic needs in the society, housing, healthcare. And we should also be thinking seriously about public works. And I can talk more about that in the question and answer, but as a way of addressing the structural unemployment that exists, by way of capital intensification. So these are like difficult problems. I don't want to present this as though there's just one solution. I'm always debating and talking with people, friends, family, other people about what possibilities there are out there. I am open to hearing about other things, but I do think this should be our focus, right? I do think that we should be focused on creating a society where there are no more disposable people, where being a poor person is not a crime, but also where being a poor person is unthinkable, right? That poverty is unthinkable, something that we can abolish in our lifetimes. I also hope that we can move towards a point where police killings are nominal, or police killings become something that's much more a part of our historical memory, rather than something that we're preoccupied with on a regular basis. So I think these are difficult issues, they're difficult problems, but I believe we can solve them collectively through conversation, through debate, and through steady work. And I hope that this presentation has moved us along in that direction. And I look forward to getting your impressions of what we might do next, what we might do differently. So thank you all.